Hey everyone, my name is Aaron Ackman and I am a principal with Good City Company. We're a land use consultant firm based here in the peninsula, and we've been hired by the city of Brisbane to help them update their codes for the objective design and development standards for new residential development. And we'll get into this in this PowerPoint. So in terms of this presentation, we're going to go over some state regulations that have been recently adopted that are compelling cities, not only the city of Brisbane, but all cities throughout California to update their codes. Go over really what are the key terms, subjective design standards versus objective design standards. Of course, go over what our community outreach and engagement standards will be. I'm recording this in mid-March. We've already started that, but there's a lot more to come in terms of community engagement, overall program schedule, and then next steps in your ability to continually be involved. So when we look at state law that's requiring cities to update their codes, there really is two major laws that is doing this. And the first is Senate Bill 35. It's a relatively new law. It's been around since about 3-4 years. And then there's a Housing Accountability Act. Now this law has been in effect a lot longer, but it's been really strengthened over the last few years. So SB 35 is known as the Planning and Zoning Affordable Housing Streamlined Approval Process, but it doesn't only apply to affordable housing or low-income housing. It also applies to market rate housing. Every 8 years, the state of California, through our regional government, tells each city in California how many homes the city has to zone for. And it also does that at each income level, so market rate housing as well as lower income housing. Now, SB 35 is tied to the city's ability to actually deliver these homes. Now, if developers have not been building homes per the zoning standards, SB 35 could go into effect. What essentially happens is the city no longer holds on to its discretionary approval process. The only thing a city could do when SB 35 goes into effect is review the development against objective standards within their code. And the fewer objective standards that they have within the code, the less discretion the city has. And we'll go more into that in later slides. Housing Accountability Act is probably the law that has the most impact on housing review within California. This was, as I mentioned, adopted nearly 4 decades ago, but it's really been strengthened over the last few years. And the legislative intent, even back in 1982, was to limit the city's ability to downsize developments or deny developments that were consistent with the city's general plan and or zoning code. So that's the key rule. If your plan says that a certain type of development could be built, a certain size development could be built, a certain number of housing units, then the city has to approve that development with the same number of housing units as long as the development complies with objective standards within the code. So that really leads to the question is what is the difference between subjective standards and objective standards, and what are some examples of both? And what happens if the city does not have objective design and development standards? So subjective standards. Now, these are taken from Brisbane's code, but I will say if you look at any zoning ordinance throughout California, you'll find a lot of the same type of language. A proposal scale, so a new housing development scale, form, proportion are harmonious, and the materials and colors used to complement this complement this project. The project integrates well with each other and maintains a compatible relationship to adjacent development. So currently, any development that has to go through the design review process, and this is key, the projects that have to go through the design review process in Brisbane are single-family homes that are ridgeline development. Most single-family home does not have to go through this process. So single-family homes on the ridgeline, multifamily development, so buildings with 3 housing units or more, and mixed-use development that contains at least 1 housing unit, so something perhaps a ground floor commercial with a residential above. Now, these terms, harmonious, complement the project, integrate well, maintain a compatible relationship, are subjective really because 2 reasonable people, whether they're sitting on the planning commission, sitting on the city council, or residents, really could have different interpretations. There's no definition of harmonious or complement or integrate well or maintain compatible relationship. So that puts property owners and developers of housing in a awkward position where they don't know whether or not they'll be able to gain approval, and state law does not want to have that happen. So what are objective standards? Well, they're quantifiable, they're measurable. So here's two examples, and these are actually from City of Brisbane's Parkside Precise Plan that was adopted a few years ago, and these are compliant with state code. The first is that third story shall be set back at least 5 feet from the wall plane of the second story and first stories below. So that's very measurable. You have your first story, you have your second story, and the third story has to be set back 5 feet. Here's a second example. At least 50% of planes of the exterior walls along public streets shall vary in depth or direction using cornices, recesses, bay windows, overhangs. So cornices, recesses, bay windows, overhangs, those are known architectural features, and 50% you can measure. You can measure 50% of the exterior walls and see if it meets that standard. So what happens if cities don't adopt these objective standards? Well, to put it the long story short is that you really limit the discretion that cities have. What the state is allowing cities to do, and it really is an opportunity, is to maximize your discretion by front-loading that discretion. So if you do not have these, though, whatever's in your code is the only thing that you could review developments by. And any subjective standards, so those harmonious words, those integrate well words, are thrown out. Cities cannot use those anymore when trying to make findings for approval for these developments. So you really end up having minimal discretion. So your city would continue to review housing developments, but there really wouldn't be a lot for the city to go on whether or not to approve those developments. You would just need to approve them. So project goals for this, and these were laid out by the Brisbane staff as well as the council when they signed this contract, is of course to inform, engage, and involve the community. This is a big effort. Developments for the next decade at least are going to be compared to these objective standards that we adopt as a result of this project. Of course, number two is to maximize local discretion. Front load your discretion through really developing a vision and developing objective standards that are consistent with that vision. So in the end, your plan is what you're planning to do, and there's a script and a formula that housing builders can follow in order to gain approval, and that's consistent with the city's expectations. 3, understand the current zoning constraints. So we're talking to property owners, we're talking to affordable housing developers, and understanding how would standards translate into objective design standards so that homes can actually be built. And then, of course, amend the zoning ordinance to incorporate these objective design and development standards for new housing development. So community engagement is going to be ongoing. It's already started. As I mentioned, it's mid-March now. We know that in community engagement will go on through the entire adoption process throughout 2021. We want to inform the community what the legal requirements are, engage the community to understand what the community preferences are in terms of physical design, and then of course go into the area where property owners will be most effective. That's in the SCR 01 zones and the NCR 02 zones, where you'll see more multifamily development in your downtown area and the area around that. So residents, the first step was creating a survey. Now the survey is online now. It's been online for over a month now. It will be online until March 23rd. So if you see this video before that and you haven't taken the survey, please do. If you haven't, that's fine. We're taking input throughout the process, and many of the terms and type of architecture here will be featured throughout this process, so it's good to understand. So we're looking at design features within the survey, building setback, so how far it's set back from the street, the building height, the location and configuration and parking. Would you prefer to see the parking within the building or underground? How you would like to see the building screened, landscaping, building articulation, and relationship to neighboring structures. Building articulation, what that means is how the building is articulated from a three-dimensional standpoint. One example, horizontal articulation, is a bay window. You know, that breaks up the monotony of a flat surface. Pitched roofs at different angles are examples of vertical integration, and there's much more. You could pause the slide here if you wanted to see additional examples. So different types of homes that we're going to look into, different types of housing developments. The first is mixed-use development. So this is where you have ground floor shops, ground floor commercial, and usually have residential above. This is going to be a key type of housing that's built in Brisbane and throughout the state of California. The second is attached single-family homes, also known as townhomes. So these still are relatively low scale, but they are a little bit more dense than single-family detached homes. Multifamily housing, this is starting to get a little bit denser. Sometimes you still do have ground floor commercial. Sometimes the bottom floor is an entryway to the apartments. And then, of course, detached single-family homes on ridge lines. Now, just a note, there's not a ton of these homes within Brisbane. There's actually a total of 16 privately held lots. 5 of those have already been constructed and gone through, or at least gone through the design review process. So there's only 11 remaining. But these are visible and they're difficult to build on, so they do go through a discretionary design review process and they're subject to these new amendments. So in terms of the Objective Design and Development Standards project timeline, as you can see, we're already through phase 1 into the middle of phase 2 right now, or the tail end of phase 2 when we're doing public outreach. We've had a planning commission meeting. April 6th, 2021 is going to be the first community meeting. Of course, because of the pandemic, because of COVID, it's going to be virtual. We're hopeful. There's a total of 3 community meetings. We're hopeful that later in the summer, at least one of these meetings could be in person. But for now, over the last year, we really have refined how these virtual outreach meetings happen, and we believe that they could be effective. And continued outreach, that's going to be a key theme. And then we're going to go into the adoption process later this year and are aiming to get it wrapped up a little bit less than a year from now in February of 2022. So I mentioned some of these, but visual preference survey is currently online. You could reach that by brisbane.ca.org/SB2. It's online through March 23rd. We've already had a number of people take it. If you haven't had the ability to take it or you're watching this afterwards, feel free to reach out to city staff if you have some preferences that you'd like to be known, or participate in the community meetings. The first is April 6th. We'll be going through a similar exercise, looking at different types of homes to give feedback. Then in late spring, we'll have meeting number 2. Summer, mid to late summer, meeting number 3, and that's when we're looking to wrap up the outreach process and begin the formal hearing process. Planning Commission, City Council. So thank you for coming through this presentation, and I encourage you to go to brisbane.ca.org/SB2. A lot of information will be continually updated there. You can find out more about the Housing Accountability Act, about the other state laws that really shape what we're doing here in Brisbane. So thank you, and look forward to your continued participation. And if you'd like to obtain additional information, feel free to click on the links in the video description box below. You could access the survey, you could RSVP to the April 6th workshop, and learn more about the project by going to brisbane.ca.org/SB2. Thank you, goodbye.